The Quiet Revolution would not have been possible without the election of Jean Lesage as Premier of Quebec in 1960. Because the Quiet Revolution was such a transformative period for Quebec, it is worth looking at how and why Jean Lesage came to power. Like everything else in politics, who wins an election is not incidental. In looking at the series of events that led up to the Quiet Revolution, it's hard not to notice certain factions which had an interest in the victory of the Quebec Liberal Party and then took actions to secure their own interests. One thing, don't judge the editing in this video. I was editing using tilt controls. Between 1944 and 1960, the province of Quebec was governed by the National Union. This political party more or less monopolized power in Quebec for the 16 years it was in power. Longtime boss of the National Union and Premier of Quebec, Maurice Duplessis, routinely used government power against the Liberal Party of Quebec, henceforth abbreviated as the LPQ, to stop them from being elected. For example, Liberal MPP René Hamel was an opponent of Duplessis. To stop Hamel from being re-elected in 1956, Duplessis refused to authorize the construction of a bridge in Hamel's riding of Shawnigan. However, Hamel was re-elected, but with a very narrow margin. Quebec under the National Union was very socially conservative compared to the rest of Canada. The Canadian welfare state that was slowly being established after World War II was simply not present in Quebec. Instead of a welfare state, Duplessis maintained the old policy of negative statism, that is, maintaining Quebec's autonomy from the federal government while not using the province of Quebec for much of anything. Instead of the state taking care of healthcare and education, the Catholic Church did. Instead of creating state-owned enterprises, Duplessis took a strong, free market, laissez-faire stance. Quebec's government was weak, but with cooperation between the church and corporations, Quebec maintained autonomy. Under the policy of agriculturalism, the youth of Quebec was encouraged to go out in the countryside in a small town and be a pious farmer. And because education was seen as secondary, Quebec didn't have skilled technical workers, so advanced industries did not establish themselves in Quebec. To be sure, under Duplessis, basic manufacturing flourished. The standard of living was rising, and American-style suburbs and shopping centers were being built. But all upper management positions in companies were filled with either Anglo-Canadians or Americans, and because the National Union looked at the countryside and traditional living as Quebec's future, the policies of social conservatism, agriculturalism, and this negative statism had kept Quebec stuck in 1944. Leftist and liberal intellectuals and journalists did not appreciate the National Union's exaggerated swagger. The Rassemblement Démocratique was an organization that comprised 100 intellectuals opposed to Duplessis. One of them was Pierre Trudeau. Many of these intellectuals regularly attacked Duplessis for putting democracy in danger. Two other journalists, Gérard Dion and Louis O'Neill, had published a denunciation of him before the 1956 election. Going into the 1960 election, the LPQ was talking of a general liberation against a great darkness and infernal political machine, something that is often overlooked when analyzing the power dynamics of Quebec at this time and why the National Union ultimately fell is the election of John Diefenbaker in 1957. With Diefenbaker as Prime Minister, Quebec, Ontario, and now the federal government were controlled by conservatives and the liberals were decisively out. Normally, a province being ruled by conservatives would not be a huge issue because it's often the case that voters vote for the conservatives provincially and the liberals federally, or the other way around. If not for the fact that Maurice Duplessis personally intervened in the election of 15 conservative MPs for Diefenbaker in the 1958 election, this led to an astonishing majority of 208 seats, or 82% of the House of Commons. If the Liberals were to have any chance at winning at the federal level, they needed to unseat a provincial leader, Maurice Duplessis, and the new leader of the Liberals, Lester B. Pearson, was intent on winning. In October 1957, the Liberals held Le Congrès de la Fédération des Jeunes Libéraux in Sherbrooke, Quebec. At this Congress, it was announced that another Congress was to be held in May of next year to elect a new leader for the LPQ and decide the direction of the party. At the beginning, there were two obvious candidates for leader, Georges-Émile Lapomme and Paul-Jules Lajoie. These were two bad options. Georges-Émile Lapomme, then leader of the LPQ, was a little paranoid that the inner party was conspiring to replace him, not without reason, as under his leadership, the LPQ lost 2 elections. The second option, Paul-Jean Lajoie, had his own problems, but he was a popular candidate because he was combative with the federal Liberals. Well, combative because the federal Liberals appropriated party funding away from the LPQ to use for themselves. Aside from that inter-party dispute, there was also an ideological difference. Under the governments of Mackenzie King and Louis Saint Laurent, there was a growing will in federal circles to expand the state through various welfare schemes. However, this expansion was directly confronting the division of powers between the federal government and the provinces as defined in the Canadian Constitution. Gérin Lajoie was a staunch supporter of Quebec's autonomy, which put him in direct conflict with the federal Liberals. As the leadership race was approaching, Lapalme did a small tour of Quebec. This tour convinced him he couldn't win and then decided to not run again at all. So Gérin Lajoie was, by default, the favored to win, unless someone else joined the race. You see, if Lajoie actually won, it would be a huge issue for the federal Liberals because the donors would not fund the campaign of someone who was basically against the interests of Lester B. Pearson. If Lajoie did not get funding, it was unlikely that he would win against Duplessis. Enter John Lesage, a former Liberal MP. There was already talk of Lesage running, but Lesage himself initially had some reservations. A lot of members of the LPQ had their own reservations because they did not want a man from Ottawa as head of the party. Even more, there were rumors that Lesage had secretly collaborated with the National Union because supporters in his federal riding also supported the National Union provincially. However, the elite of the Liberal Party wanted Lesage. Maurice Lamontagne, a major figure in the Liberal Party, and Father Lévesque, a Catholic priest influential in the LPQ, were both dead set on having Lesage as the party's head. And just as it happens, both Lesage and Lester B. Pearson were vacationing in Florida at the same time. In a meeting with Pearson, he convinced Lesage to consider joining the race, although Lesage still had another problem. Lesage did not want to step on the toes of Georges-Émile Lapalme, and Lapalme initially didn't like Lesage very much because he saw him as a man from Ottawa. Lapalme and Lesage then met in the presence of Maurice Lamontagne, who made great efforts to gaslight Lapalme into accepting Lesage. And after Lapalme had confirmed he wouldn't be running, Lesage officially joined. Even if Lapalme didn't like Lesage, he disliked Gérin Lajoie more. Lapalme called him the Kid and the Little Prince because Gérin Lajoie's voice was high-pitched and he had a smug, arrogant demeanor. And now, it's important to touch on who exactly Maurice Lamontagne was. I don't like using this term, but he can be accurately described as an international elite. He graduated from Harvard and is a member of the Club of Rome. He was pushing for John Lesage so hard because they were already known to each other. Lamontagne served under Lesage in the federal government. Without the support and connections of Maurice Lamontagne, Lesage would not have even had a chance at winning. Lamontagne was the major domo of Lesage, someone who guaranteed his election. Aside from Pearson and Lamontagne, Lesage had the support of what seems to be the entire financial elite of Canada. The senators Paul-Henri Bouffard and François-Philippe Ray supported Lesage, and both were connected to the financial sector, as Bouffard was the director of the Bank of Canada and Bray served on many corporate boards. Both of these senators were responsible for a great deal of Liberal Party fundraising. C.D. Howe, an industrialist, financier, and businessman who served in Mackenzie King's cabinet, also supported Lesage. Louis Gélina, another financier, promised John Lesage $281,000 a year if he became leader of the LPQ and until he won a seat. As an aside, if I say a money figure in this video, assume I've already used an inflation calculator on it because $25,000 in 1958 is $281,000 today. Oh my god. To not labor the point, 2 other financiers from Quebec, René Paré and Maurice Sauvé, also supported Lesage. This might seem like conspiratorial behavior, but don't think about it. Blissful ignorance is good now, guys. Don't worry. Despite all this, Lesage was not necessarily a man from Ottawa imposing the will of a few financial elites on the poor LPQ. Lapalme ended up ceding to Lesage on the basis that Lesage would take up the programs and policies that the LPQ were already planning out. Lesage was a compromise between the federal Liberals and the provincial Liberals. One side gets their man in office to appease donors, the other gets to keep their political programs. Both sides win win, the general public loses. At the Liberal Congress of May 1958, there were 4 candidates, but only realistically Jean Lesage and Paul-Jean because the other two had the support of basically no one. It's not accurate to say that Lesage won the election. He wiped out Jean Lajoie. He received 630 votes compared to 145 for Jean Lajoie. During campaigning, partisans from Jean Lajoie's camp accused Jean Lesage of being an asset of the Liberal Party who was just parachuted into his position. I mean, after doing the research for the script, I can hardly say they were wrong. Despite that, Jean Lajoie did end up working with Lesage because politicians have no morals and principles. I would say something about how an organized minority always beats a disorganized majority, but I already made that video, so I will just say that, aren't you glad we live in a democracy? The next general election of Quebec would be in June 1960, and Jean Lesage would have to beat Maurice Duplessis, except what's that? Duplessis died on September 5th, 1959 due to a cerebral congestion. Like that, Paul Sauvé became Premier of Quebec on September 9th. Even though Maurice Duplessis was disliked by libtards, he was loved by many as a sort of paternal autocrat. His passing stirred emotions and there was general mourning. Initially, the untimely passing could be considered opportune for the Liberals because all the personal loyalties that were invested in Maurice Duplessis had disappeared, if not for the fact that Paul Sauvé turned out to be an exceptionally competent leader. Sauvé began necessary reforms, making changes that even the Liberals had been asking for. Quote,
Every week in his public declarations, Sauvé announced measures to improve the lot of a particular group. Student scholarships, salary increases in the civil service, increased autonomy to municipalities, and less restrictive labor laws.
Page 111. Jean Lesage et la Révolution tranquille. The fiery rhetoric launched by the Liberals against the National Union began to be seen as playing politics, unnecessarily harsh and partisan. Overall, the National Union was in a pretty good position going into the 1960 election, if not for the fact that Paul Sauvé passed away on January 2nd, 1960 due to a heart attack. By this point, the National Union was in disarray, not only for the 2 sudden deaths, but because a year earlier, there was a massive scandal over politicians in the National Union government buying the stocks of a gas company that now owned the public distribution network and in so doing had made profits. You know, standard government corruption stuff. Not like this still happens today all the time. Before being defeated in the leadership race, Jean Lajoie was already well known in liberal circles and his base of elite support came from journalists and intellectuals. Among the intellectuals that were aligned more with Jean Lajoie than Lesage was René Lévesque. Lévesque was a host at Radio Canada and at a popular news show called Point de Mire. And in preparation for the election, Jean Lesage had recruited Lévesque as a politician. Lesage, Lévesque, Lapalme, and Jean Lajoie were all familiar faces to Quebec's public and were often referred to as star candidates even within the Liberal Party. They capitalized on this by referring to themselves as the Thunder Team or L'équipe du Tonnerre. René Lévesque being on the team may have hurt the Liberals more than helped them. The National Union accused Lévesque of having socialist and even communist sympathies, which was effectively taken up by Quebec's conservative society. The communist totalitarian dictator Fidel Castro arrived in Montreal on April 26, 1959. Castro was then interviewed by Lévesque when no one else in Canada bothered to hand out attention to an oppressive communist thug. And because Lévesque had later quit Radio Canada to be a lying politician, the new leader of the National Union, Antonio Barrette, has said that if Lévesque planned on returning to Radio Canada if he lost the election, he would create a new state broadcaster for Quebec so that he couldn't. Liveshit historians often say that the National Union wrongly and slanderously accused their enemies of being communist, when in reality, every single so-called accusation that the National Union made was true. There's no point in calling them accusations when they are on the completely sound and factual basis of interviewing someone. The combinations of the passings of Maurice Duplessis and Paul Sauvé, the financial elite supporting the LPQ, the natural gas scandal, and the resulting disorganization in the National Union were all gifts to Jean Lesage. During the 1960 election, the National Union was so divided that they didn't even publish a platform. The new leader of the National Union, Antonio Barrette, was even in conflict with its own party, as they refused to give him control over the party's coffers and of the party's newspaper, Montréal Matin. On top of that, the LPQ had adopted superior campaigning techniques, as John Lesage enlisted the help of a television producer because TV was now seeing wide adoption in Quebec, as well as the rest of the world. The Liberals won a majority. Well, they would have won a majority no matter how they won, because only the National Union, the LPQ, and a single solitary independent won seats. But what may be surprising is that the Liberals won with a small margin. In a partnership with a polling company, the LPQ ran a poll right before the election and found out that nationalist sentiment was very mild in Quebec, especially when it came to social issues. The LPQ had overestimated the issue of Quebec's autonomy and economic nationalism, and their own party platform, which was based around autonomy and economic nationalism, turned out to be unpopular. Essentially, a light sliding of the rural vote had brought the Liberals to power. The mandate for John Lesage was shallow, but they're going to use it to its full extent. If you have noticed, every person mentioned in the video so far is a man, not dirty femcells eating gros failure dinners. That's because Quebec society was still very conservative, although I have not put much of a focus on the Father Levesque, who was an important character in supporting Lesage. Just having a Catholic priest be influential in the Liberal Party today would be shocking. The events that I've just finished outlining all take place before 1960. The leaders of the new and liberal Quebec were about to initiate a transformation so revolutionary that Quebec society would be unrecognizable in 6 years, not only socially speaking, but politically, in terms of power dynamics. And before closing this part, I would like to present two similar but distinct events to get a feel for how much Francophone society would change. In 1939, when King George VI and Queen Elizabeth toured Canada, huge crowds greeted the royal couple in Montreal. The historic church of Notre Dame in the Place d'Armes was draped with an enormous Union Jack. The Bishop of Quebec, who was widely seen as a nationalist, welcomed the royal couple as Dieu sauve le roi was sung in churches. It would be hard to believe today, but Montreal outspent Toronto on the tour. A writer for Le Devoir, Omer Oru, even lamented that the visit had recaptured the hearts of French Canadians. When Queen Elizabeth visited in 1964, instead of receiving her with open arms, there were mass protests. In Quebec City, there were large demonstrations and police brutality. October 11th has come to be called Samedi de la Matraque, or Baton Sunday, by Quebec's intelligentsia. Catholicism had been smashed as a fundamental pillar of Quebec society, being replaced by a liberationist ideology. The Queen was now seen as a symbol of colonialism and oppression. Originally, I was going to make an hour-and-a-half long video going over the entire Quiet Revolution, but because I'm in pursuit of an extremist single Udmurt pagan woman to be my wife, and because this will take up all my time, I will not be able to complete the entire thing until maybe March or April or May or June of 2025. I think I will be married by June 23rd, 2025, so that my marriage can coincide with midsummer, and I will be blessed to be in a happy, Uralic pagan marriage. I'm probably going to spend half a year in Russia, but I won't have enough time to learn Russian either. At first, I thought that learning Udmurt was going to be hard because there are no resources, but there is actually a book in French called Parlons Udmurt, which teaches Udmurt. So I can say that learning French has helped me in finding my wife, just not in the way that I expected. Okay, anyways, I'm uploading this video alone, and eventually when I do end up completing the full Quiet Revolution video in maybe 6 months, I will merge this small video about the election of Jean Lesage into the whole. And because of the fact that I put a lot more research into this video than any other one, when I put out the full video, I will have a list of citations in it. See you soon.